The auctioneer's gavel had not yet fallen when Caroline Archer realized that every man in that dusty room intended to rob her blind, and not a single one of them felt even the smallest measure of shame about it. The auction house in Harlan Creek, Texas, smelled of sawdust, pipe smoke, and the particular kind of greed that settles into a room like heat settling into stone. It was the spring of 1878, and Caroline had been a widow for exactly 43 days. She knew the number precisely because she had counted each one of them the way a person counts steps on a dark staircase carefully, with one hand pressed to the wall, terrified of what might happen if she lost her footing. Her husband, Daniel Archer, had been thrown from a spooked horse 3 days after a late-season ice storm had glazed the east pasture. He had not died immediately. That had been the cruelest part. He had lingered for 9 days, drifting in and out of a kind of half-sleep that was neither rest nor waking, and Caroline had sat beside him through every one of those nights with a damp cloth in her hands and prayers rising from her lips that the Lord had apparently seen fit not to answer. Daniel had left behind 3 things of any material value: a 2-room house that needed a new roof, a modest piece of land on the western edge of the county, and 41 head of mixed cattle Longhorn crosses mostly, ranging in age from spring calves to a pair of mature bulls that Daniel had been quietly proud of. He had also left behind a considerable debt, which was the 4th thing, and the thing that nobody mentioned politely but everyone in Harlan Creek knew about. The debt was owed to a man named Harlan Birch, which was a name so perfectly suited to the man that Caroline sometimes thought fate had a cruel sense of humor. Birch was the largest landowner in the county, a wide-shouldered man with flat gray eyes and the kind of permanent half-smile that never quite reached those eyes. He had extended Daniel credit 2 years prior when a drought had driven the hay prices through the ceiling, and he had done it with the graciousness of a man who already knew how the story would end. Now the story was ending, and Birch stood at the front of the auction room with his hands folded behind his back, looking entirely satisfied. The auction had been organized under the supervision of the county land office, technically neutral, technically fair. The man running it was a squint-eyed administrator named Fowler, who was not technically corrupt, but who had a way of looking at Birch before he made any significant decision, as if checking to make sure the weather was acceptable before stepping outside. Caroline sat in the front row of rough-hewn chairs in a black dress that was still stiff with newness because she had only purchased it 4 weeks ago. Her hands were folded in her lap. She was 27 years old, dark-haired, with the kind of face that people described as composed even when everything beneath that composition was screaming. She had grown up the daughter of a Missouri schoolteacher, had married Daniel when she was 22, had moved out to West Texas with him because he had spoken about the open land the way other men spoke about God, with a reverence that made you believe there was something genuinely holy about it. She had not regretted coming. She had made a life here, real and rooted. But now the roots were being pulled up, and she was watching it happen, and her composure was the only thing she had left to hold onto. Fowler shuffled his papers at the podium and cleared his throat. "We are here today," he said, in the particular tone of a man who had rehearsed his neutrality carefully, "to settle the estate of the late Daniel Archer of the Archer property, situated on County Road 7 at the western boundary of Harlan Creek County. The estate includes certain livestock and property to be assessed and sold against outstanding debts as recorded by this office." He adjusted his spectacles and looked up. Item 1. 41 head of mixed cattle, presently held in the Archer South pasture. The estate has requested a fair market assessment. Do we have any assessor's reports on the value of this livestock? A man near the wall, a rancher named Greer who ran cattle on the county's north side, stood up. He was a friend of Birch's in the casual, business-minded way that men in small counties became friends with the most powerful person in the room. "I rode out to look at those cattle last week," Greer said, with the comfortable confidence of a man who has already decided what he is going to say regardless of what he saw. "In my assessment, that herd is in poor condition." The longhorn crosses are small-framed, the bulls are showing their age, and 3 of the spring calves are not going to make it to summer. I would value the lot at no more than $60. Maybe 65 if someone is feeling generous. A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembled ranchers and interested parties. Caroline felt her stomach drop straight through the floorboards. $60. 65. She knew what those cattle were worth, because Daniel had talked about nothing else in his final year of health. He had graded them, evaluated them, planned the season's breeding program with the careful optimism of a man who believed the future was going to be better than the present. Those cattle were worth between $300 and $400 if handled properly. Every man in this room knew it, and every man in this room was choosing not to say so. She opened her mouth. She did not know exactly what she intended to say, but she intended to say something, because the alternative was to sit quietly while 41 cattle and everything they represented were assessed at a sixth of their actual value, and handed over to clear a debt that Birch had spent 2 years engineering this exact moment to collect on. "That is not accurate," she said. The room went quiet in the uncomfortable way that rooms go quiet when a woman says something that no one expected. Fowler looked at her over his spectacles. "Mrs. Archer, you are permitted to observe this proceeding, but—" "My husband assessed those cattle himself last November," Caroline said, and her voice was steady even though her hands were not. She pressed them flatter against her thighs. "He graded them against the county livestock registry, and the 2 bulls alone were valued at $40 each by the circuit veterinarian who visited in the fall. The full herd, in good health and properly counted, is worth no less than $320 at current market prices. Anyone who tells you otherwise is not speaking from honest observation." Birch turned to look at her. His half-smile did not change. "Mrs. Archer," he said gently, with the particular gentleness of a man who is very confident he is going to win, "I understand your grief and your anxiety. These are difficult circumstances, but the assessor's reports speak for themselves, and the assessor's report is from one man who is your neighbor and your hunting partner," Caroline said. She heard the edge in her own voice and did not try to file it down. "That is not an assessment. That is a favor." Another murmur through the room. Fowler tapped his gavel once, not sharply, more as a suggestion than a command. Greer looked offended. Birch's expression settled into something that was still calm but had lost its warmth entirely. "The assessment stands," Fowler said. "If there are no other bids on the livestock, $60 is the opening figure," Birch said smoothly, stepping forward. "I will take them at 65. 65, Fowler repeated and reached for his gavel. And that was when the voice came from the back of the room. It was not a loud voice. It was quiet, actually, the way certain sounds are quiet, in the way a stretch of flat horizon is quiet, not empty but settled. It carried without effort, cutting through the low murmur of the room with the precise directness of a thrown stone. "I will take them all," the voice said, "at $300. Every head in the room turned. The man standing near the back wall was tall in the loose-limbed way of men who have spent years in a saddle, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair showing under a worn cattleman's hat that he had not removed, which in this part of Texas was less a rudeness than a statement. He wore a plain canvas shirt the color of old timber, practical trail pants, and boots that had seen considerable honest use. He was perhaps 30 years old, perhaps a few years older, with the kind of face that gave nothing away, easily angular, watchful, with dark eyes that were currently scanning the room with a calm, assessing patience that was somehow more unnerving than anger. Nobody seemed to know him. Birch's half-smile had gone entirely now, replaced by something flat and calculating. "I don't believe I know you," Birch said. "No reason you would," the man said. "Name's Clayton Trask. I have been riding through this county on my way north. I stopped because I am looking to build a foundation herd. Those cattle meet my requirements." He paused. $300, cash money. Fowler was looking at Birch. Birch was looking at Clayton Trask. The room was very still. "Cash money," Fowler repeated slowly, as if testing the phrase. Clayton reached into the inside pocket of his shirt and produced a folded envelope, which he set on the empty chair beside him with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has already thought 3 steps ahead of this moment. "You are welcome to count it," he said, "but the number will be correct." What happened in the next 30 seconds was a kind of invisible negotiation, conducted entirely in the exchanged glances between Birch and Fowler, the tight silences between statements, the slight adjustment of Birch's posture from expansive confidence to something more guarded. The thing about cash money in 1878 in a county land office was that it was very difficult to argue with on paper. Legally, and Fowler knew it, Birch cleared his throat. "300 is excessive for that livestock," he said. "The assessments are not binding on buyers," Clayton said, still quiet, still level. "I am offering to pay $300 for the Archer herd. That covers the outstanding debt and leaves a remainder for the estate. If you would like to outbid me, Mr. Birch, the floor is open." Birch looked at him for a long, hard moment. Then he looked at Greer. Greer gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug that communicated a kind of regret, without offering anything useful. Bidding $300 for cattle he had just helped assess at 65 was the kind of public contradiction that even a man like Birch could not easily swallow without losing face. "No further bids," Fowler said, with a slightly strained version of his neutral voice. "The Archer herd, 41 head of mixed cattle, is sold to," he glanced at his notepad, "Clayton Trask at $300. Cash settlement." The gavel came down. Caroline sat very still for a moment, aware of a feeling she could not immediately name, something between relief and confusion and a strange, sharp alertness, as if the entire room had just changed temperature without anyone opening a window. She turned to look at the man in the back of the room. He was already folding the envelope back into his pocket. He had not looked at her during any of it. He was looking at Fowler with the patient attentiveness of a man completing a transaction. Then, as if he felt the weight of her gaze, he glanced toward the front of the room and met her eyes for a moment. He did not smile. He gave her a single, brief nod, the small, composed acknowledgement of someone who has done something ordinary, and then he returned his attention to Fowler. Caroline realized she was gripping the front of her dress with one hand without having decided to do it. She released the fabric carefully and tried to compose her expression into something that did not reveal quite so much of the wildness she was feeling inside. The settlement took another 20 minutes to formalize. Daniel's outstanding debt to Birch was $410, which the land office confirmed. The $300 cattle sale was applied against it, leaving a remaining balance of $110, which Caroline would need to address within 60 days or the property itself would come under consideration. It was not the perfect outcome, but it was a survivable one, and 40 minutes ago she had not been sure survival was on the table. She was standing outside the auction house on the raw timber boardwalk when she heard boots behind her, and she turned to find Clayton Trask coming out of the door behind her, tucking a receipt into his shirt pocket. Up close, he was different than he had appeared from across the room. Not smaller, but more particular. She could see that he was perhaps 32, with the kind of careful stillness about him that spoke of long habit rather than mood. His eyes were a deep, dark brown, and they were, she noticed, genuinely attentive in a way that was different from the performative attentiveness of men who paid attention to women primarily to make an impression. "Mr. Trask," she said. He stopped. "Mrs. Archer, you know my name." It was mentioned several times in the proceedings. A pause. The street of Harlan Creek moved around them with its ordinary afternoon business, women in bonnets, a freight wagon grinding through the dust, 2 dogs investigating something near the hardware store. "I want to thank you," Caroline said. "What you did in there was a business transaction," he said, not unkindly, just plainly. She looked at him for a moment. "You paid $300 for cattle you have never examined. That does not sound like a simple business transaction." Something shifted in his expression, very slightly. A flicker of what might have been amusement or recognition. "I grew up on a cattle ranch in southern Colorado," he said. "I know what healthy longhorn crosses look like from 40 feet, and I know what a fixed assessment looks like from 100 feet. Your husband built a good herd." "He did," she said, and the tightness that entered her throat when she said it was something she had been managing for 43 days with varying degrees of success. She pressed past it. "The cattle are in the south pasture. I can have them ready to move whenever you like. I imagine you will be wanting to drive them north." "Yes," he said. "I will need a few days to arrange the drive. I have a man coming down from Amarillo I was expecting to meet." "You are welcome to camp on the property while you wait," she said, because it was the practical thing to offer, and because some impulse she did not examine too carefully wanted him to say yes. "The bunkhouse hasn't been used since our last hand left in November, but it's solid. There's a water pump and a proper stove." He considered this for a moment. "I don't want to impose. You have just paid $300 to keep my husband's herd from being stolen at auction," she said, with the kind of directness that her mother had always called unladylike, and that Caroline had always found more useful than the alternative. "You are not imposing. You would be doing me a favor by being on the property while I am trying to get my accounts in order." He looked at her for another moment, and then he nodded. "All right, thank you." She had brought the wagon into town, and he had tied his horse to the back of it, a sturdy bay gelding with a white blaze that he called nothing in particular, referring to it simply as the horse in the way that working men sometimes do, giving their tools familiarity without ceremony. They rode out to the Archer property in the early afternoon with the spring sun warm and direct, and the land opening up around them in the particular way that West Texas land opens, not dramatically, not with mountains or rivers, but with a slow, enormous generosity, as if the earth itself was spreading its hands. Caroline drove. She was a competent driver, and she did not feel the need to pretend otherwise. Clayton sat on the bench beside her with his hat on his knee, looking at the passing land with an expression she could not quite read, and she found herself wondering who he was in all the ways that the brief transaction at the auction house had not explained. "You said you're going north," she said after a while. "Montana Territory," he said. "I have land there. A section I purchased 2 years ago through a land agent. Nothing on it yet. I have been building up capital to stock it." "That's a long way to drive a herd." "It is," he said, "but the grass up there is still good before the sheepmen and the fences get to it." She glanced at him sideways. "You sound like a man who has thought about this for a long time." 3 years, he said, "give or take." "What were you doing before?" He was quiet for a moment. "Hired work. Various ranches through Colorado and Kansas and down into the Panhandle. Before that, the war." He said the last part the way people in 1878 said the war without clarification, because there was only one war that mattered in anyone's accounting of their life, and everyone still carried the weight of it without needing to specify which side of it they'd been on or what it had cost them. Caroline did not press further. She understood the sentence as the boundary it was. "Daniel served too," she said quietly. "He came back different. Not bad different." Just she searched for the right word, quieter than he left. "That's common," Clayton said. They came over a low rise, and the Archer property opened up below them, modest by the standards of the county's large ranches but real and solid. The house with its needed roof repairs visible from here as a slightly uneven line against the sky. The barn in better repair. The water tank that Daniel had constructed 2 summers ago with salvaged lumber and considerable optimism. And below the south slope, barely visible from here but present as a low rumble of movement, the cattle. Caroline watched him look at the land. She watched him look at the cattle. His expression did not change exactly, but something in his posture shifted, and she understood in that moment that what he had done at the auction was not entirely impersonal. She did not say this out loud. The bunkhouse was indeed solid if not precisely comfortable. It had a narrow cot, a small iron stove, a table with one sound leg and one that required a wedge of folded paper to stabilize, and a window with actual glass in it, which was more than many bunkhouses offered. Clayton thanked her for it without making much of it and put his gear in the corner without ceremony. And by the time Caroline had returned from the barn after settling his horse, he was already down at the south pasture fence doing what she had already half expected him to be doing, which was quietly walking the perimeter of the herd, counting cattle. She stood at the fence for a moment and watched him. He moved among the animals without agitation, with the practiced ease of a man who had spent years earning the calm tolerance of livestock. The cattle did not scatter from him. The bulls, whom even Daniel had approached with a certain careful respect, watched him with mild curiosity rather than alarm. "Your count is off," he said without turning around. She blinked. "I'm sorry, you said 41 head, there are 43. She walked to the fence rail and leaned on it, looking. She counted slowly. He was right. 2 of the calves must have been born after Daniel did his last count, she said. In January, perhaps. I have been managing as best I could, but I am not. She stopped. You are not a cattle woman, he said, still not turning around but without any judgment in the statement. I am learning to be one, she said, and there was something in her voice that she had not entirely intended to put there, something that was equal parts defiance and real vulnerability, because those were the 2 emotions that had been sharing space inside her for the past 43 days, and sometimes they fought for the same ground. He did turn around then. He looked at her for a moment, and she was struck again by the quality of his attention. It was not appraising, not the way that men often looked at young widows, calculating what the circumstances might mean for them. It was something more fundamental than that. He was simply looking at her the way he had looked at the cattle, honestly, carefully, registering what was actually there. You are doing well enough, he said, for someone who has been managing alone. She did not know why that particular sentence affected her as strongly as it did. It was not effusive. It was barely even a compliment, but it was real, and after 43 days of people either pitying her or underestimating her or both, real felt like cool water. Thank you, she said, quietly. He turned back to the cattle, and she stood at the fence for a while longer than was entirely necessary before going back to the house to start supper. She had not consciously decided to include him in the supper invitation, but when the food was ready she found herself walking to the bunkhouse door and knocking on it anyway, and when he appeared in the doorway with his hat off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, she said, "There is enough for 2 if you have no objection," and he said, "No objection," and followed her to the house. The kitchen was small and honest, with a good iron cookstove and a table that sat 4 comfortably or 6 if you did not mind your elbows touching. She had made a beef stew with the last of the salt-cured shoulder she had kept from the fall butchering, and there was sourdough bread that she had baked that morning because baking was the thing she did when anxiety was trying to take her over, and strong black coffee. He ate with the attentive appreciation of a man who was genuinely hungry and had been eating trail food, and he thanked her for it simply and without ceremony. They talked through supper. It surprised her how naturally it came. He asked about the property, the water situation, the composition of the herd, asking practical questions that had practical answers, and she found herself grateful for the straightforwardness of it, the complete absence of the careful tiptoeing that people had been doing around her since Daniel died. She asked him about Montana Territory, and he described it without romanticizing, which she respected. He talked about the quality of the grass, the severity of the winters, the work it would take to establish a working ranch from scratch. He had an engineer's relationship with his own ambitions. He saw them clearly, measured them accurately, and planned for the gaps between where he was and where he intended to be. "Do you have family waiting there?" she asked. It was a question that sat at the exact edge of what was appropriate to ask, and she was aware of it even as she asked it, but curiosity had always been stronger in her than propriety. He was quiet for a beat longer than the other questions had required. "No," he said. No family. She did not push, but she registered the tone of it, the small, contained weight of it. "Neither do I anymore," she said after a moment. "My parents are in Missouri. Daniel's family is in Georgia. There's no one here." He looked at her across the table. "That's a hard position to be in," he said. "It is what it is," she said, which was a thing she had been saying a lot lately and which meant several different things depending on the moment. Sometimes it meant acceptance. Sometimes it meant she was refusing to look at something directly. Sometimes it meant both. The evening light was going amber through the west window, and the kitchen was warm with the residual heat of the stove. And for a moment, they were simply two people sitting across from each other in the plain, honest light of a spring evening. And Caroline was aware of a feeling she could not entirely account for, not grief, not quite. Something more like the awareness of life continuing, of the world insisting on its own forward motion, even when you were not sure you were ready to move with it. He left after supper with a brief, genuine thanks, and she watched him cross the yard to the bunkhouse, and then sat alone at the kitchen table for a while, not thinking about anything in particular, or perhaps thinking about one thing in particular and choosing not to name it yet. The next 3 days had a kind of rhythm to them that Caroline had not expected. Clayton was up before sunrise. She could see the pale smoke from the bunkhouse stovepipe from her bedroom window when she first woke, which meant he was up and had started his fire at least an hour before her. By the time she was in the kitchen, he had already been out to check the cattle, usually had some quiet observation to share over the morning coffee she offered as a matter of course, and then spent the day doing things that needed doing. Not ostentatiously, not with any particular announcement. She came out one morning to find him repairing the south fence rail that had been sagging since February. Another afternoon, she discovered, he had realigned the water trough so that it drained properly instead of pooling in the corner where it had been creating mud. He did not ask for permission or expect praise. He simply saw what needed attention and attended to it. She found herself watching him more than was entirely natural. Not mooning, she told herself firmly. Observing. She was a practical woman and she made practical observations, and what she observed was a man who moved through the world with a kind of quiet, grounded purpose that she had not encountered in that particular combination before. Daniel had had purpose, but it had been louder, more urgent, wrapped up with enthusiasm and occasional anxiety. Clayton's purpose was different, slower burning, deeper rooted, like the difference between a grass fire and a coal seam. On the second afternoon, he showed her 3 things she had not known about her own cattle. He showed her which of the calves was carrying the respiratory disease that Greer had used to devalue the herd. It was real, but it was early stage and treatable with the pine tar solution he mixed up from supplies in the barn. He showed her which of the mature cows was about to go into labor. She had not noticed the signs. He showed her how to read the condition of the herd from the fence in the morning, by watching the way they moved in the first hour after sunrise, when lethargy or pain showed up most clearly. She stood beside him at the fence on the second afternoon in the warm spring air with the cattle moving easily below them, and she said, "You are teaching me things that will no longer be useful once the cattle are gone." He looked at her sideways. Knowing how to read cattle is always useful, even if these particular cattle are gone. "I may not have other cattle," she said. "I still have $110 debt and 60 days to address it." He was quiet for a moment. "What are your options?" She had been thinking about this constantly, and the honesty of the question allowed her to lay it out plainly. "The house and land itself are worth more than the debt if I sell. But I don't want to sell. This is the home Daniel built. It's the place I came to when I had nowhere else to come to. I don't want to give it to Birch." She paused. "I have the vegetable garden which I can expand. I have 3 chickens and a rooster. I know how to cook, clean, sew, and teach school." She paused again. "The nearest school is 12 miles away and they already have a teacher." $110 in 60 days, he said, thinking aloud, not dismissively, just calculating. "It feels impossible," she admitted, which was harder to say than anything else she had said in the past several days because admitting impossibility was not something she had allowed herself to do very often. He looked at the cattle for a while. The 2 new calves weren't included in the auction sale, he said slowly. Technically, the auction covered the 41 head that were listed. The 2 new calves are not part of that sale. She looked at him. What are you saying? I am saying that if those 2 calves are yours, they are worth between $12 and $15 each at fair market value. That's $30. Not enough on its own, but it's a start. He paused. The mother cow in the east corner, the one who's about to drop her calf, that one is mine per the auction, but the calf she's about to have is new. That's another $8 to $10. Caroline felt something shift in her chest. You are trying to find money for me. He did not answer immediately. He looked out at the pasture with that particular, settled expression she had already started to think of as simply being his way. Then he said, I'm trying to find you facts that are useful. What you do with them is up to you. She looked at him for a long moment. The spring light was clear and warm, and the cattle were moving with the easy, purposeful contentment of well-fed animals on good grass, and she was standing next to a man who had walked into an auction room 3 days ago with no stake in her situation and had changed the entire direction of her life, and was now quietly trying to do it again. Clayton, she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name. He looked at her. Why did you do it? She asked. In the auction room. You could have passed right through Harlan Creek and never thought about it again. He was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that means something is being genuinely considered rather than avoided. Then he said, I know what it looks like when a room has decided to be unfair. I grew up watching my father's ranch be picked at by men with better lawyers and more political friends until there was nothing left. He died before he could do anything about it. He paused. I didn't want to watch it happen again if I could stop it. It was more than she had expected him to say. She could see that it was more than he usually said, from the slight tension that followed the words, the way he turned back to the fence as if to give himself somewhere to look. I'm sorry about your father, she said. It was a long time ago, he said. But she could hear, in the way he said it, that it was not as far away as all that. That evening they sat on the porch after supper, and she told him about Daniel, about who he had been before the war, which had been a laughing man with enormous plans and genuine warmth. About who he had been after it, which was a quieter man who still had all those things but carried them more carefully, the way you carry something that has been repaired after breaking. About the cattle, which had been his particular passion and his particular hope. She told him about the drought 2 years ago and the decision to take Birch's credit, which had felt reasonable at the time, and had haunted them both in the 18 months since. Clayton listened without interrupting. He sat in the second porch chair with his coffee going slowly cold on the rail beside him, and he listened the way very few people listened, with his full attention, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually taking in what she was saying. He sounds like he was a good man, Clayton said when she had finished. He was, she said, not perfect, but genuinely good. The best ones never are perfect, he said. Perfection in a person usually means they haven't been tested yet. She looked at him. That is unexpectedly philosophical for a cattle buyer. The corner of his mouth moved. It was the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him. Cattle buying gives you time to think. She laughed. It surprised her, not the laugh itself, but the ease of it, the way it came without any of the guilt that had been shadowing every other moment of pleasure she had managed in the past weeks. She pressed her hand over her mouth immediately after as if she could catch it back. You don't have to stop laughing, he said quietly. She looked at him. Grief doesn't require silence, he said. At least that's my understanding. I believe you can honor someone and still find reasons to laugh. They're not in competition. She looked at her hands in her lap. Some people in this town would disagree with you. Some people in most towns would, he said. That doesn't make them right. She looked out at the darkening yard, at the bats beginning their first passes of the evening over the water tank, at the particular shade of deep blue that the Texas sky turned just before the stars came out. It was a beautiful evening. It had been beautiful evenings before, and she had been too exhausted and afraid to notice them. She noticed this one. The man you're waiting for from Amarillo, she said. When do you expect him? He wired me from Amarillo 3 days ago. He should arrive in Harlan Creek by day after tomorrow, and then you'll drive the herd north." "Yes," she nodded. The word yes settled in the room between them with a weight she had not entirely anticipated. On the fourth morning, two things happened. The first was that the East Corner cow went into labor at first light, and it was not a clean labor. Clayton was at the barn when it started, and Caroline came out at the sound of the distress the animal was making to find him already knee-deep in the problem, calm and systematic and entirely competent. She did not stand back and watch. She helped. She did as he asked without any of the flinching that people might have expected from a woman who had spent most of her life in towns, because Daniel had been right when he told her that farming and ranching had a way of stripping away the luxury of squeamishness. The calf was positioned wrong. They worked for 40 minutes in the cool morning air in the east pasture to correct the problem and bring the animal out safely, and when it was done, the calf alive and breathing, and already making the uncertain, newborn movements of a thing discovering the fact of its own legs. Caroline sat back on her heels in the grass and let out a long breath and felt something that was not complicated at all. Simple, clear relief. Clayton was crouching a few feet away with his forearms resting on his knees, watching the calf. He was dirty and tired and entirely at ease. "You did well," he said. "So did you," she said. He looked at her, and for the first time his expression was not composed exactly. It was something more open than that. Something that noticed her not just as a practical person in a difficult situation, but as a specific person, Caroline, this particular woman kneeling in the grass with the morning light in her hair and muddy hands, and the particular clarity in her expression that comes from having just helped something survive. She did not look away from him. The second thing that happened that morning was Harlan Birch. He rode up the front drive at mid-morning with one of his ranch hands trailing behind him, and Caroline came out of the house to find him standing at the porch steps with his hat in his hands and his flat gray eyes doing their calculation. "Mrs. Archer," he said, "I wanted to come by and speak with you directly as a courtesy." "A courtesy," she said, "about your remaining obligation." He said it carefully, with the practiced sympathy of a man who had delivered this kind of message enough times to have smoothed all the rough edges off it. $110 in 60 days is a significant ask for a woman in your position. I want you to know that I am prepared to discuss a different arrangement. The property, the house and land both, valued at fair market. I know what you want, she said, and the answer is no. His eyes moved past her, and she knew without turning that Clayton had come around the corner of the house because she had heard his boots on the packed earth. "Mr. Trask," Birch said, and the warmth of his tone dropped several degrees. "I did not realize you were still on the property." "Arranging transport for my cattle," Clayton said, coming to stand beside Caroline in a way that was not theatrical but was entirely deliberate. "Is there something I can help you with?" Birch looked at him. The calculation was visible even through his composure. Clayton Trask was not a man from this county. He had no history here, no political debts, no connections Birch could pull. He was simply a large, steady, competent-looking man who was standing next to Caroline Archer and looking at Birch with the patient attentiveness of someone who has already assessed a situation and found it unsurprising. "Just a social call," Birch said finally. He put his hat back on. "Mrs. Archer, the offer stands whenever you are ready to reconsider." He left. Caroline stood on the porch step until the sound of his horse had faded down the road, and then she sat down on the step and put her hands on her knees and breathed for a moment. "He will not stop," she said. "No," Clayton agreed, sitting down on the step beside her without invitation and without asking, which felt entirely natural. "Men like that do not stop. They wait." "I have 60 days," she said. "And $30 from the uncounted calves if the land office confirms they were outside the sale." "I have been thinking about that," Clayton said slowly. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it as a business proposition rather than charity, because I do not offer charity and this isn't that." She looked at him. "The 43 cattle I purchased, 45 now. with this morning are worth considerably more than $300 if they are moved to Montana grazing land and allowed to develop properly. The two bulls alone, in Montana market conditions rather than Texas conditions, could produce a stud fee income over the next 4 to 5 years that would dwarf what I paid for the whole herd. I am not telling you that because I want your thanks. I am telling you because I want you to understand that the transaction at the auction was also genuinely good business for me. He paused. What I am proposing now is this. I have land in Montana. I have cattle now. What I do not have is someone who can manage the home operation while I am working the range. A bookkeeper, a supply manager, someone who can correspond with buyers and track expenses and keep the kind of records that a legitimate ranch operation needs to function. He stopped. I am not doing this well. She was watching him very carefully. What are you actually proposing? She said. He was quiet for a moment. When he looked at her with the same directness he had been bringing to every other thing. I am proposing that instead of a cattle drive north with a hired man, I drive north with a business partner. That the Montana operation be a shared one. Another pause. I'm also aware that you have $110 debt that needs addressing in 60 days, and that a partnership would allow me to clear that debt against your future share of the operation, which is, I believe you would agree, materially preferable to selling your land to Harlan Birch. She looked at him for a long time. The spring morning was quiet around them, the cattle moving below, the new calf unsteady and urgent at its mother's side. You have known me for 4 days, she said. Yes, he said. And you are proposing a business partnership. Yes, he said again. And more than that if I am being entirely honest. But I am trying to propose the part that requires only business sense first, because the other part, the more than that, is something I would want you to think about in your own time without feeling any obligation. Because you don't owe me anything, Mrs. Archer. I want to be very clear on that. Caroline sat with that for a moment. The honesty of it, the care in it. The way he had laid out both things and separated them deliberately so that she could take the practical offer without having to navigate the emotional one if she was not ready, and so that she knew the emotional one was there if she was. The more than that, she said quietly. Yes. Are you saying that you have feelings for me, Mr. Trask? After 4 days, he was quiet. Then he said, I am saying that I have not met anyone who strikes me the way you do and that I would like the opportunity to find out what that means, but only if you want to, and only when you are ready. There is absolutely no pressure involved. She looked out at the cattle for a while, then she looked at her hands. Then she looked at him. He was looking back at her steadily, without urgency, without any of the manipulative performance that a lesser man might have employed in the same moment. He was simply being entirely, quietly honest and waiting. There is a practical problem, she said. Yes, he said. In 1878 in Texas, a business partnership between a woman and a man who are not married is not a thing that will be recorded without complications. I am aware, he said. And you are proposing to drive north in 3 days to a territory that is many weeks away. The hired man from Amarillo, he started, would manage the cattle on the drive, she finished, but not the other thing. He nodded. She was quiet for a very long time. There is a minister in Harlan Creek, she said finally, in a voice that was very even. Reverend Miles. He is a decent man and he is not in Birch's pocket, which distinguishes him from most of the office holders in this county. Clayton looked at her. I am not saying yes to the more than that, she said carefully. I am not saying I have feelings for you that are equivalent to what you seem to be describing. I have known you for 4 days, and I am a practical woman, and practical women do not fall in love in 4 days. She paused. But I am saying that I can recognize when someone is genuinely good. And I am saying that I would rather build something new with someone who has already shown me who they are, than spend 60 days figuring out how to survive in Harlan Birch's county alone. Another pause. And I am saying that the idea of Montana, of starting over on good land without the weight of everyone's expectations and sympathies, I would be lying if I said that did not sound like something I could want. He was watching her very carefully now. I am asking you, she said slowly, to give me until tomorrow morning to think about it. Of course, he said immediately. And I am telling you that if I say yes to the practical arrangement, I need you to understand that I will be a full partner, not a housekeeper with a better title, a partner. That is what I meant when I said it, he said, and the steadiness in his voice told her that this was entirely true. She stood up from the porch step and smoothed her dress and looked at him for one more moment. Until tomorrow morning, then, she said, and went inside. She sat at the kitchen table for a very long time that afternoon. She thought about Daniel, about what he would have made of the situation, and she thought she knew. He would have liked Clayton Trask. He would have respected the kind of man he was. He would have told her not to let grief make her choose smallness over possibility, because that was the kind of thing Daniel had believed, that life was meant to be pursued rather than endured. She thought about Montana, about land she had never seen, under a sky she could only imagine, about building something from the beginning, with no debt and no history and no one watching with either pity or judgment. She thought about the man in the bunkhouse, who had walked into a room full of thieves and said a number out loud and changed everything. She thought about the way he had looked at her over the body of the newborn calf that morning, with that particular openness in his eyes, and the way it had made her feel something she was not quite ready to name, but that was warm and real and alive in the specific way that things feel after a long period of numbness. When she woke the next morning before sunrise and lay still for a moment with the cool spring air coming through the bedroom window, she knew that she had already decided. She had probably already decided the previous afternoon, which was why the thinking had felt less like choosing and more like watching herself arrive somewhere she had been heading for a while. She found him at the south fence at first light as she had expected. Yes, she said. He turned from the fence. Yes to the practical arrangement. Yes to both, she said. And then, before she lost her nerve or her composure, Daniel would have liked you. He had a gift for recognizing people who were genuine. He would have seen it in you immediately. And I think that matters to me, as a measure of something. Clayton looked at her for a long moment, and his expression was doing something she had not seen it do before, something open and a little uncertain and entirely human. He crossed the distance between them without hurry, and he took her hand, and he held it in the same way he did everything carefully, without excess, with complete attention. I will do my best to be worth that, he said. I know you will, she said. That is rather the whole point. They were married by Reverend Miles 3 days later, on a Friday afternoon in the small white church at the edge of Harlan Creek, with the Reverend's wife and the postal clerk as witnesses, which was all the ceremony that was either required or desired. Caroline wore her second-best dress, which was not black, which felt both transgressive and right. Clayton wore his cleanest shirt and had trimmed his beard and held her hand through the ceremony with the same steady attentiveness with which he held it at the fence. And when Reverend Miles pronounced them married and Clayton looked at her, she saw in his dark eyes something that was quiet and sure and entirely committed, like a river that has found its proper channel and is moving with the confidence of water that knows where it is going. She pressed her hand against his arm as they walked out into the afternoon and felt the warmth of him, solid and real. The hired man from Amarillo arrived the following day. His name was Pete Henshaw, a lean, talkative man in his late 40s with a silver mustache and the cheerful, pragmatic energy of someone who had worked cattle drives since before Clayton was born. He assessed the herd with brisk expertise and pronounced them in better condition than he had been led to expect, which earned him a dry look from Clayton and a smile from Caroline. 2 days before the drive was to begin, Caroline went to the land office with the documentation Clayton had prepared, the certificate of marriage, the transfer of his Montana property interest to include her name, and the $340 from the sale of the uncounted calves. They had ultimately been assessed at market rate by the land office. producing enough, combined with the money Clayton had received from the settlement, to clear the Archer property debt with money remaining. She paid the $110 to the account and received a receipt, and she stood outside the land office for a moment with that receipt in her hand, feeling the particular, specific pleasure of a debt being eliminated, which is one of the cleaner feelings available in human experience. She did not look at Birch's office across the street. She did not need to. She went home and she packed 2 trunks and a leather bag with the things she was taking to Montana. Practical things, warm things, the kitchen tools that had been wedding gifts from her parents, the small framed daguerreotype of Daniel from the mantelpiece, and a single volume of poems that she had been carrying from home to home since she was 17 and was not going to stop carrying now. On the last night in the house, she sat at the kitchen table alone for a long time and said goodbye to the walls, to the light through the west window, to the place where Daniel had built her a shelf specifically, because she had mentioned once that she always wanted a proper place for books. She was not crying, she was honoring something which is different. Clayton knocked at the kitchen door at 9 o'clock. "Come in," she said. He came in and sat across from her and did not say anything useful or unnecessary. He just sat with her, which was what she needed him to do, and he understood that without being told. After a while she said, "I am ready." "Then we will go," he said. They left Harlan Creek at first light on a Tuesday in mid-April of 1878, with 45 head of cattle moving north on the Kishom Trail extension, Pete Henshaw riding point on his spotted roan, Clayton flanking on his bay, and Caroline on a steady gray mare that Clayton had purchased for her 3 days prior, and about whose purchase she had expressed very specific opinions regarding the horse's temperament. Because she was not going to spend 600 miles on an animal that had not been properly evaluated. The drive north was not a romance in the way of novels. It was long, physically demanding work. It was saddle sores and river crossings, and one particularly difficult afternoon in Indian Territory, where a stretch of disputed grazing land required careful navigation. Not because of the violence that people in the East imagined was everywhere in the territory, but because of the genuine complexity of land rights and the justified wariness of the people who had lived on that land before the treaty agreements had systematically dismantled their ability to enforce their own claims. There was a moment at the crossing of the Cimarron where they encountered a small camp of Cheyenne families who were working their own route south, and the exchange that happened there, conducted mostly in silence, and the careful mutual assessment of people who had reason to distrust each other's kind, ended with the Cheyenne elder accepting a side of salt-cured pork from their supply and Caroline producing, from her trunk, a bolt of good wool cloth that she had packed from Harlan Creek, and the 2 parties separating with the kind of respect that is different from friendliness, but is its own meaningful thing. Pete Henshaw observed this quietly and afterward told Clayton he had not worked with anyone else's wife who had the same quality of straight-back dignity when it mattered, which Clayton received as the compliment it was, and which he later passed along to Caroline word for word. She laughed at the else's wife part, and he smiled a full smile by now, not just the corner-of-mouth movement she had first catalogued. A real, warm, genuine expression that was still economical but entirely present, and she thought again that she recognized something in him that felt more like coming home than she had words for. They had been married for 3 weeks and had been riding together for most of those weeks, and the process of being together without the formal social structures of town life had accelerated the knowing of each other in ways that neither of them could have anticipated from the outside. They argued twice, once about the best route through the Kansas grasslands, which she turned out to be right about, and he acknowledged straightforwardly without defensiveness, which she found enormously attractive. Once about the question of what they would do if the cattle market in Montana was lower than projected, which was not an argument so much as an honest, somewhat tense conversation about fear and contingency planning that ended with both of them more fully understanding where the other stood. She asked him once on a night when they were camped on the edge of the Kansas plain with the fire going down and Pete Henshaw sleeping at the other end of the camp, whether he had been afraid in the auction room in Harlan Creek. He thought about it. Not afraid exactly, he said. Worried that Birch would outbid me. He had the money for it. He chose not to spend it because he had expected to get the cattle without spending money. What would you have done if he had outbid you? He was quiet for a moment. I had $420 in that envelope, he said. She looked at him. You told Fowler the number would be correct at 300. It would have been, he said. The number I stated would have been correct. I would simply have restated a higher number if Birch had bid. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, that is very slightly dishonest. It was a room full of men conspiring to steal from a widow, he said evenly. I am comfortable with my choices. She laughed, and then she moved closer to him on the bedroll she had spread near the fire, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into the solid warmth of him and watched the fire go to embers, and felt, unmistakably, that she was somewhere she wanted to be. It took them 6 weeks to reach the Montana Territory land. They entered the territory in the first days of June, and what opened up before them? The long, enormous sweep of the grasslands with the mountains visible to the west in blue and white, and the sky above it all a color that Caroline had never seen before. Not the hard-edged blue of the Texas sky, but something softer, wider, more generous was not what she had imagined from Clayton's descriptions, which had been practical and economical. It was, very simply, one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen. She reined the gray mare in at the top of a long rise and sat still for a moment, not because she had been asked to stop, but because she could not make herself move through the view without acknowledging it. Clayton came up beside her and stopped also, and she was aware of him looking at the land with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something that was not composed, something that was open and young and filled with a joy that had the quality of a long-deferred arrival. This is it, he said. He said it quietly, as if to himself. This is it, she agreed. He turned to look at her, and the joy in his expression shifted into something that included her, that was suddenly not just about the land but about the two of them standing on the rise of it together, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest that was large and uncomplicated and entirely real. Caroline, he said. Yes, she said. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. I know this has not been a conventional beginning, he said. No, she agreed. And I know there are things between us that are still, he searched for the word, still coming into being. Things that need time. I am not in any hurry. She looked at him. His dark eyes were full of the light of the Montana sky. He was dusty from 6 weeks on the trail, and his beard was fuller than it had been in Harlan Creek, and he was looking at her with the same absolutely direct, absolutely honest attention that had disarmed her from the very first moment in the auction house, when he had said, I will take them all, as if it were the simplest possible thing. Clayton, she said. Yes. I am no longer talking about things coming into being, she said. I believe they have arrived. He was still for a moment. Then that real smile came, the full one, warm and genuine, and it changed his whole face the way sun changes a field, not altering it but revealing what was always there. He leaned across and kissed her, unhurried and certain, with the Montana wind around them and the cattle moving below them on the long grass, and it was, she thought, exactly the right way for an arrival to feel. The land was a section in the eastern part of what would become Custer County, a long, river-bent piece of ground with good water access from a tributary of the Yellowstone, flat enough for ease of operation, but broken by enough rolling terrain to provide windbreaks and summer shade. There was nothing on it yet except the land itself and the possibility of everything. They set up their first camp on the property on a Tuesday evening in June, and for the next 2 weeks they slept in a tent while Clayton and Pete Henshaw began the foundational work of a working ranch. Pete had agreed to stay on through the building season in exchange for a fair wage, and the promise of a permanent position if the operation took hold, which it would, because Caroline had already begun corresponding with buyers in Helena about beef prices, and had found them considerably more favorable than Texas rates, which vindicated Clayton's entire Montana strategy in a way that both of them acknowledged with considerable satisfaction. The house went up in stages, as all honest houses do. First the frame, then the walls, then the roof, which was the part Caroline insisted they get right before they worried about anything interior, having spent a year in a Texas house with a compromised roof and being entirely unwilling to repeat the experience. Clayton understood this completely and gave it the same careful attention he gave everything, sourcing good lumber from a mill 40 miles to the west and taking 3 extra days to lay the roof boards properly, even though Pete had argued they could do it faster. By late August they had walls and a roof and a functional kitchen and 2 bedrooms and a good solid porch facing west over the long grass toward the mountains, and they had 38 of their original 45 cattle still alive and growing, the 7 losses attributable to the crossing of the Platte, and 1 sick animal they had identified early and separated. They also had, by August, a marriage that had grown into something that neither of them had quite anticipated. Deep, settled, warm, and shot through with the specific pleasure of 2 people who genuinely like each other finding out daily, new reasons to continue doing so. They talked constantly, about the ranch, about the land, about the buyers Caroline was developing a correspondence with, about the things they had read and thought and wondered about. They disagreed occasionally and resolved it honestly. They worked side by side without pretense or performance, and the work itself was one of the things that bound them, the shared exhaustion and satisfaction of building something real. In the evenings they sat on the westward porch and watched the light change over the mountains in colors that seemed, every evening, like something you were seeing for the first time. Pete Henshaw would retreat to his bunkhouse, a proper one now, better than the one in Harlan Creek, with 2 windows, and Caroline and Clayton would sit with their coffee and sometimes talk and sometimes not, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that has been earned. She told him once in the early fall, with the aspen on the hillsides going gold and the air carrying the first edge of the coming cold, that she had not expected to feel this way about her life. That she had thought, after Daniel, that the best she could hope for was something decent and quiet. That she had not expected this particular quality of happiness, which was not the absence of difficulty or grief, but something that existed alongside those things without being diminished by them. He listened to her say all of this, and then he said, I had stopped expecting most things. I had decided that the ranch in Montana was enough to want. That wanting more than that was, I don't know, inefficient. He paused. I was wrong about that. She reached across and took his hand, and he turned it and held hers. You are allowed to want more than efficiency, she said. I am learning that, he said, slowly, with good instruction. She laughed and leaned into his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat that way while the aspens went from gold to orange in the evening light, and the first stars came out over the mountains, and the ranch around them was quiet and working and real. The first winter in Montana was serious in the way that Montana winters are serious, relentless, vast, and uninterested in compromise. The temperatures dropped in November to levels that made the hardest Texas winters seem mild, and the snow came in waves that were not violent exactly, but were persistent in a way that made you understand how landscapes are shaped over time. They had prepared well, with enough hay laid and good insulation in the house, the cattle brought to the lower pasture, where the natural windbreak of the river bluff reduced the worst of the exposure. Caroline spent the winter months expanding the bookkeeping operation she had been building since their arrival, establishing ledgers that tracked every aspect of the ranch's finances with the meticulous clarity of someone who had grown up watching a schoolteacher account for every penny of a limited salary. By January, she had corresponded with 4 buyers in Helena and Bozeman, and had secured forward sale agreements on 12 head of steer at rates that represented a 20% improvement over what they would have received in Texas. She also spent the winter writing letters, one to her mother in Missouri, who wrote back 3 weeks later with a page of controlled relief and tentative joy that had her mother's voice in every line. One to Daniel's family in Georgia, which was harder and took several drafts, but which she finally sent in the honest, careful words she had found for it. That she had honored Daniel's memory, had carried it with her across a great distance to a new place, and had built something new that she believed he would have recognized as the kind of life he had always been trying to make. She also wrote one letter to the Harlan Creek Land Office confirming that the Archer property, the house and the land, was to be placed on the market for general sale, and that the proceeds of that sale were to be administered through the county land office. She asked that Reverend Miles handle the correspondence regarding any potential buyers. She did not write to Birch. She did not think about Birch very much at all, which was, she considered, the best possible outcome. In February, with snow lying 2 feet deep on the Montana plain, and the cattle settled in their winter patterns, and the house warm with the heat of the cook stove, and the companionship of 2 people, who had come to depend on each other in all the ways that matter, Caroline told Clayton that she thought she was pregnant. She said it in the morning, over coffee, with the matter-of-factness that she brought to most important things, which was not the absence of feeling but the expression of deep feeling in a form that required less protection. He put down his coffee cup and looked at her, and what passed across his face was something she had come to understand about him, that his deepest feelings were always slower to reach his surface than other people's, not because they were smaller, but because they had to travel further, through layers of self-containment that had been built over a long time and were still, gradually and willingly, coming down. When the feeling reached his expression, it was everything she could have hoped for. He was across the table in 2 strides and had her in his arms, holding her with the particular, complete fierceness of a man who has been given something he had not permitted himself to fully want until it arrived. "Are you sure?" he said into her hair. "Reasonably sure," she said into his shoulder. "I will need to confirm with the doctor in Miles City when the weather permits, but yes, reasonably sure." He held her for a long time without saying anything else, and she held him back, and the house around them was warm, and the snow was falling outside the kitchen window in the particular quiet way that February snow falls in Montana, and she felt, very simply, that she was home. The doctor in Miles City confirmed it in March when the roads cleared enough to make the journey. A baby expected in September. The doctor, a practical, capable man named Patterson, who had been serving the expanding ranching community of eastern Montana for 4 years, noted that Caroline was healthy and well-nourished and organized, and said so with the slightly surprised admiration of a man who did not always find these things in combination in the women he saw. Clayton drove her back from Miles City in the wagon with the spring mud churning under the wheels and the first green appearing in the low spots of the hills, and he held her hand for most of the drive, and when she commented on this, noting, with affection, that it made steering somewhat complicated, he switched the reins to his left hand and kept holding her hand with his right, which was not entirely safe but was absolutely intentional. "I am going to be fine," she said. "I know you are," he said. "I am just holding your hand. You are holding my hand because you are worried." "I am holding your hand because I want to," he said, with the serene composure of a man who has entirely decided what he intends to do and is not going to be argued out of it. She smiled and leaned her head against his shoulder and let him hold her hand for the rest of the journey home. Spring arrived on the ranch with the particular urgency of Montana spring, which moves fast after holding back long. The cattle came through the winter in better shape than Clayton had projected, which Caroline attributed partly to the preparation, and partly to luck, and partly to what she called good intentions on the part of the land, which Clayton did not disagree with. They added 7 more head through a purchase from a neighbor to the north, a straightforward Scots-Canadian man named Mac Allister, who ran 100 head on the section directly above theirs, and who had been watching the Trask operation with professional interest since their arrival. Mac Allister came to supper one evening in May, and sat at the good kitchen table that Clayton had built during the winter from milled lumber with a care that showed in the smoothness of the joints, and he ate Caroline's cooking with undisguised appreciation, and told them that they were doing well for first-year operators, and that the word in Miles City was that the Trask cattle were good quality stock, which was not the kind of thing Mac Allister said to people he did not genuinely mean it to. Pete Henshaw had taken the permanent position, as predicted, and had also, in a development that neither Caroline nor Clayton had quite foreseen, but that in retrospect was entirely predictable given the characters involved, developed a quiet, steady friendship with the cook and housekeeper at Mac Allister's ranch, a sensible widow named Martha Burrows, who was perhaps 5 years Pete's senior, and who came occasionally to visit, and eventually came a great deal more than occasionally, and whose presence Pete ceased pretending was anything other than what it was after Caroline raised an eyebrow at him, once across the breakfast table, with the specific expression that requires no words. "None of your business," Pete said, with absolutely no convincing force. "Of course not," Caroline agreed pleasantly and gave him more coffee. The summer moved through its long, golden Montana days. Caroline managed the correspondence and the books with an efficiency that Clayton had stopped being surprised by and started simply being proud of. And she managed the household and participated in the range work on the days when the pregnancy allowed it, and accepted the days when it did not with a pragmatism that impressed the doctor and irritated her slightly, but that she honored because it was what the situation required. She and Clayton fell into the rhythms of a marriage that was working, not without friction, not without the ordinary difficulties of two strong-willed people sharing one life, but with the genuine, sustained effort of people who have decided that the thing they are building together is worth the work required to build it properly. He surprised her in ways she had not expected. He was funny, quietly and consistently, with the specific dry humor of someone who observes things precisely and reports them accurately, and who understands that accuracy alone is often the best form of comedy available. He was tender in ways that he had not initially revealed, in the kind of attentiveness to small needs, knowing when she needed quiet, knowing when she needed the opposite of quiet, knowing when to make coffee and when to make conversation, and when to simply sit. That was a more profound form of care than most people manage. And he was honest. This, she thought, was perhaps the most important thing. He was honest the way some people are devout, not perfectly, not without effort, but as a fundamental orientation, a direction he consistently tried to move in even when the other direction would have been easier. The baby was born in September, on a Tuesday evening with Dr. Patterson in attendance, and Pete Henshaw exiled to his bunkhouse with a cup of whiskey and Clayton present and entirely steady, holding her hand through the hours of it with the same calm, focused attentiveness he brought to everything. It was a boy. They named him Daniel Clayton Trask, and the naming of him was something Caroline had arrived at on her own and presented to Clayton on the morning of the birth, and Clayton had received it the way he received most things of importance from her, quietly, with his full attention, and with an expression that said he understood exactly what it meant without requiring it to be explained. Daniel Clayton Trask was, from his first hours, loud and opinionated and entirely unimpressed by the size of the world he had arrived in, seeming to feel that the world was what needed adjusting to him rather than the other way around, which was a quality that both of his parents recognized immediately and that Pete Henshaw observed from his first viewing of the infant in the bunkhouse doorway and commented upon with the tactful directness of a man who has spent 40 years working with cattle and has learned that most things share a common set of characteristics. "He's got your eyes," Pete told Clayton. "He's got her voice," Clayton said. "God help us all," Pete said, and had a great deal of trouble hiding that he was pleased. The autumn and winter passed with the new weight and texture of a household that contained a baby, which is a different experience from any other experience available to human beings, involving more noise and less sleep, and a kind of helpless, enormous love that has no adequate description, but that both Clayton and Caroline fell into completely. By the second spring, the operation had grown to include 60 head, a proper hay barn, a proper bunkhouse with 2 additional hands that Clayton had hired in the fall, both veterans of trail drives, both capable and straightforward, and a reputation in the Miles City cattle market as a reliable source of quality Longhorn Cross beef. The correspondence Caroline managed had expanded to include 3 regular buyers and 2 potential new contracts, and the ledger she kept showed, for the first time, a positive annual balance. She sat at the kitchen table on an evening in April of 1880, 2 years almost to the week from the day in Harlan Creek, when a man's voice from the back of a room had said, "I will take them all," and she looked at the ledger and at the positive numbers in it. And then she looked up at the window over the kitchen sink, beyond which the Montana evening was doing the particular thing it did in spring, the light going soft and golden over a landscape that still, every evening, seemed to her like something miraculous. She heard Clayton on the porch steps. He came in with little Daniel on his shoulder. The boy was 7 months old and had recently discovered that shoulders were preferable to all other forms of transportation, and Clayton had adapted to this with the easy acceptance of a man who has found the perfect reason to slow down, and he looked at the ledger and then at her. "Good," he said. "Very good," she said. "We are $63 ahead of last year's same period, and the Helena contract looks like it will come through." He set Daniel down carefully into the high-sided wooden box they used as a cradle near the stove, and the boy made a brief noise of protest at the loss of the shoulder, then accepted the situation and devoted his attention to his own fists, which were endlessly interesting to him. Clayton came to stand behind Caroline's chair and bent to look at the ledger over her shoulder, one hand resting on the table beside hers. "I owe you something," he said. She looked up at him. "What could you possibly owe me?" "When I walked into that auction room in Harlan Creek," he said, "I told myself it was a business decision. That the cattle were worth buying, that the price was good, that it was purely practical." He paused. "That was true, but it was not the whole truth." "No," she said softly. "The whole truth was that I walked in and I saw you sitting in the front row of a room that had already decided you didn't matter, and you were sitting there with your hands folded and your back straight, and the most composed, determined face I have ever seen on a person who was doing their very best not to let anyone see how frightened they were." He paused again. "And I thought that if there was anything in my power to do, I was going to do it." She turned in her chair to look at him. He was standing very close, the warm kitchen light on his face, his dark eyes entirely honest and entirely hers. "You could have just bought the cattle and gone north," she said. "Yes," he said. "You could have settled the transaction and moved on." "Yes, but you stayed." "I found I could not leave," he said simply. "I found that the idea of leaving was entirely unacceptable." She stood up from the chair and put her hand against his face, and he turned into it slightly, the way he did when she touched him like that, a small and unguarded movement that she had found from very early on to be one of the most honestly intimate things about him. "I am glad you are impossible to argue with," she said. "You argue with me quite successfully on a regular basis," he said. "I am glad the good arguments are the ones worth winning," she amended. He smiled, that full, genuine smile that had taken her 2 weeks on the trail to earn the first time, and that she now received every day with the understanding of what it was, and what it cost him, and what it meant that he gave it freely. He kissed her, there in the kitchen with the evening light and the sound of the baby in his cradle, and the ledger with its positive numbers on the table. And it was the kind of kiss that does not contain urgency so much as certainty, the deep, grounded certainty of 2 people who have found each other, and recognized the finding for what it was, and decided, deliberately and completely to stay. The second year on the ranch brought more changes, all of them good. The Helena contract came through in June of 1880 and represented the largest single sale the operation had made, 32 head at a favorable rate. Mac Allister to the north proposed a cooperative grazing arrangement for the back sections of both their properties that made practical sense for both parties. And over the course of the summer, a kind of neighborly friendship developed between the two households that Pete Henshaw and Martha Burrows benefited from considerably, since Martha had taken to spending 3 or 4 days a week at the Trask Ranch by midsummer, which Pete pretended was for the purpose of helping Caroline, who appreciated the help but also appreciated Pete's happiness in a way she chose not to embarrass him with directly. In August, Martha and Pete announced, with the combined embarrassment and defiance of two people who have not entirely expected to fall in love at their age, that they intended to marry in September, and Caroline embraced Martha and Clayton shook Pete's hand and then embraced him, which surprised Pete considerably and visibly moved him, and they had a supper that evening that was loud and warm, and that Clayton described afterward as one of the best evenings he could remember. Daniel Clayton Trask celebrated his first birthday in September of 1880 with the focused gravity of a person who is not entirely sure what is happening, but is prepared to eat the cake and assess the situation from there. He had his father's dark eyes and his mother's directness, and a laugh that had, since its first appearance in December of his first year, been filling up the house in the way that a child's laugh fills a house, completely, with no space left over for anything smaller. The following spring, when the aspens were green again and the cattle were back on the upper pasture, and the house was full of the smell of bread from the oven, Caroline told Clayton she was pregnant again. He held her hand this time without being asked. The second child was a girl, born in November of 1881, and they named her Eliza Ruth Trask, the Ruth from Caroline's grandmother who had been a Missouri woman of considerable backbone and who Caroline felt deserved to have her name continued. Eliza was, from the beginning, entirely different from her brother, quieter, more observant, arriving in the world with the particular stillness of a person who intends to watch carefully before acting, which was a quality that made Clayton laugh quietly and privately for reasons that Caroline understood completely. Daniel, who was 2 years old and intensely interested in the new member of the household, spent the first 2 weeks of Eliza's life examining her from as close a distance as his parents would allow with the concentration of a scientist, and eventually declared her acceptable, which Eliza received with the indifference of someone who had not needed his approval in the first place. By 1882, the Trask Ranch was one of the established operations in that section of eastern Montana, known for quality cattle and reliable dealing, and the particular combination of thorough bookkeeping and good land management that made buyers trust the Trask operation above several of the larger, but less carefully run ranches in the county. Clayton had added another section of land through purchase from a departing homesteader to the east, and the herd had grown to over 90 head. He had also in that year been asked to serve on the County Livestock Board, which was a volunteer administrative body that helped establish fair market standards and adjudicate disputes about grazing boundaries and cattle assessment, and which was, in other words, exactly the kind of body whose absence had allowed the Harlan Creek auction to happen the way it did. He had accepted without drama, and had served with the same straightforward, unglamorous honesty that characterized everything else he did. Caroline, watching him from across the room at the first board meeting, which was held in the Miles City Courthouse, and which she had attended because she was the ranch's financial officer and had been invited in that capacity, thought that she had now seen him in every setting that a man could be placed in, and that he was the same person in all of them. This was, she had decided, the most significant and important quality a person could possess. On an evening in the fall of 1882, 4.5 years after a Tuesday morning in a Texas auction house, Caroline sat on the west-facing porch of the house that had grown, over 4 years, from a frame and a prayer into a solid, real, beautiful home, with Eliza asleep inside, and Daniel in the yard chasing the dog that Pete had given him for his second birthday, and Clayton beside her with his coffee and his arm around her shoulders. The mountains to the west were going purple and gold in the last of the autumn light. The cattle were settled in the lower pasture. The smoke from Pete and Martha's bunkhouse, which had been expanded when they married into something more accurately described as a cottage, rose in a thin, comfortable line. The aspens had gone full gold on the hillsides. "Are you happy?" she asked. She asked it sometimes, not because she doubted, but because she liked to hear it. He was quiet for a moment, not the hesitating kind of quiet, but the considering kind, the kind that meant he was taking the question seriously. "Yes," he said. Then more slowly, "I used to think happiness was a kind of equilibrium, a settled state. I thought if I got the land and the cattle and the operation running properly, there would be a moment when things balanced out and stayed balanced. And now," she said, "now I think happiness is a direction," he said, "not a place you arrive at and stay, a way of moving. And I believe I have been moving in the right direction since the day I walked into a room in Harlan Creek, Texas, and decided not to walk back out." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the mountains, but after a moment he turned and looked at her, and his dark eyes were full of the evening light and everything he had ever been and everything he was still becoming. "I feel the same," she said, in different words. "What are your words?" he asked. She thought for a moment. Daniel's laughter floated up from the yard below, and the dog barked, and the mountains held the last of the light. "Mine are simpler," she said. "I am home, I am loved. I have built something that is mine with someone who is mine in a place that belongs to both of us." He pulled her closer. "Those are better words than mine," he said. "They have always been," she said with affection. He laughed fully, warmly, with the ease of a man who has learned that happiness does not have to be protected from laughter, and kissed her hair. And she leaned into him, and the evening moved around them in the particular Montana way, vast and quiet and entirely full. Daniel came in from the yard with muddy boots and a happy face, and Eliza woke inside and made the first small sounds of wakefulness. And Pete came out of his cottage and called up the slope that supper was, if anyone wanted it, at his table tonight. And Clayton stood up from the porch chair and held out his hand to Caroline. She took it as she had been taking it for 4 years, as she intended to go on taking it, not because she needed steadying, but because some things were simply true and worth repeating every single day. They went inside together, into the warm, lit house with its smell of bread and wood smoke, and the sounds of children, and the particular piece of a life that had been built, deliberately, with the right materials, honesty and effort, and the willingness of two people to find each other in a dusty room in 1878 and refuse to let go. Outside, the Montana sky went from gold to deep blue to the first stars, and the ranch settled into the quiet of a working evening, and the mountains held their position on the horizon, and everything, all of it, was entirely, completely, and permanently all right.